So I'll just do a brief introduction for the 3 or 4 people who were not here the last time. Professor Brian van Norden, and you are familiar with his work already. He's a translator of Chinese philosophical texts, a scholar of Chinese classical and contemporary philosophy. He's a public intellectual, which is how most of us got to know about his work, through his article in the New York Times. He's currently teaching at NUS Yale. And the basic thrust of the book, Taking Back Philosophy, is about how to diversify the philosophical canon, something that's sorely needed, something that's an exigent issue in South Africa at present, as to how to make our disciplinary formations more open to other genealogies and to other linguistic traditions and so on. So the fundamental question that Professor Van Norden raised in his first lecture was to raise the issue of, is there something called Chinese philosophy, the various sophistries that are advanced to put forward the idea that philosophy originated long, long ago in a place far, far away in Greece, and that all others are minor versions of this major font of knowledge. He raised he presented the lecture in terms of some of the issues that Chinese classical philosophy takes up, questions of ethics, questions of human nature and compassion, and the nature and protocols of argumentation, which led us to some of these delightful and intricate twists in the Tao philosopher's mode of argumentation. But one of the questions that he didn't raise, and which was implicit in the lecture, was the intriguing afterlife of the idea of China. Once the idea of China and Chinese philosophy have been introduced into the European canon, through the Jesuits starting in the 17th century, so that people like Diderot, Hume, Adam Smith, all of them were reflecting on the place of China in the question of empathy and distance. So this idea of, if something were to happen in China, would it and should it affect the sentiments of people living in Europe? And that became one of the central problems in philosophy, the question of the implications of distance and the killing of the Chinese Mandarin. If your actions kill the Chinese Mandarin, then it was equated to the issue of blindness, that what you cannot see is not something that you would empathize with. So China continues to figure in multiple ways as metaphor initially, and then through genealogies which have been largely forgotten, modes of argumentation, like as you pointed out, in the case of Quesnay and the idea of laissez-faire, how Quesnay draws upon the idea of laissez-faire from a Chinese monarch who believed in the idea of letting things be. So these were some of the issues that were raised the last time. Now we're carrying the story forward to the present, I suppose. So over to you, Brian, and thank you. Look forward to more erudition and wit.
Well, I can't promise that, but thank you again for having me, and thank you to everyone for coming. So let's start with this gentleman. This is the Kangxi Emperor, and you can see his reign dates down here. He was an emperor in the Qing Dynasty, the last Chinese imperial dynasty. And the period he ruled over was one of the greatest periods in Chinese history. Chinese influence stretched out about as far as it ever has. Chinese culture was flourishing. Chinese economics was flourishing. However, just about 100 years after the end of his reign, the Qing dynasty was in serious trouble, and within 200 years after the end of his reign, the last Chinese imperial dynasty was over, and the imperial system was gone forever. What happened? Well, 3 things happened. The Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, and the First Sino-Japanese War. Let's look a little bit at each of them. This is the HMS Nemesis, which, if you're a naval history buff, that's the first ocean-going steam-powered warship. And this is a British painting, but a fairly accurate one of it making very short work of Chinese war junks during the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars occurred because Britain developed a trade deficit with China because people in the United Kingdom really enjoyed Chinese tea, but there really wasn't much in China that people, in the UK, that people in China needed. And so enterprising entrepreneurs in China came up with a great idea to sell something in China. They said, well, great, we'll sell opium. And the great thing about opium is once you start selling it, people will come back for more because it's addictive. So this helped address the trade imbalance. Understandably, the Chinese government got upset about the effect that opium importation was having on the country, and so they outlawed it. And the United Kingdom decided to take the moral high ground by waging war against China to force it to allow the importation of opium. Now, I should say, I discovered I have to make this clear from previous talks. When I say the United Kingdom took the moral high ground by forcing China to allow the importation of opium, that's irony. I gave a version of this talk once somewhere, and someone raised their hand and said, I don't think that was taking the moral high ground at all. It's like, no, I'm sorry, I was being sarcastic. I specified that. But in addition to being humiliating, the opium wars involved the ceding territory to other countries. So Hong Kong was ceded to the United Kingdom during this period. And it became clear to the other European powers that China couldn't compete technologically with modern weapons. As if that wasn't bad enough, in the same century, the 19th century, the Taiping Rebellion broke out. And the Taiping Rebellion was started by a Chinese man who had repeatedly failed to pass the civil service examinations. But he discovered in a dream that he was Jesus' younger brother. And so he started this movement to overthrow the government and establish a heavenly kingdom on earth led by himself as Jesus' younger brother. Now, eventually, the Taiping, that's what they were called, the Taiping were put down, and this is a Chinese painting of a city being recaptured from the Taiping by government forces. However, the conflict was incredibly bloody. Estimates are that about 20 million people died, either as the result of direct military action or as the result of starvation and disease that were consequent upon the warfare, the disruption in health services and food and water. Now, during this period, Japan had rapidly modernized. Japan had just made a decision that samurai were going to turn in their swords for briefcases and go abroad to the United States and Europe to learn how to forge modern weapons and how to organize modern armies and how to do telegraphy and railroads. So this is part of the Meiji Restoration, which occurred starting in the 19th century. So Japan very quickly modernized, and then at the beginning actually at the end of the 19th century, the first Sino-Japanese War occurred. And the Chinese military was easily defeated by the modern, well-equipped Japanese military. And as a result, effective control over Korea was ceded to Japan, and also Taiwan was effectively ceded to Japan. So all these things just show the weakness of the Qing government, and they loosened people's confidence and loyalty to the Qing government, and they also emboldened foreign powers. So this is why England came in, seized Hong Kong, but other powers were very close behind, and this is a color-coded map of the spheres of influence of various foreign powers in China around 1910. And in the words of one Western diplomat, the European powers and then Japan were carving up the Chinese melon, just carving China up into spheres of influence. And what that meant was that effectively the Chinese government didn't actually have control over these areas. So, for example, if you were in Hong Kong and you were a British national and you murdered a Chinese person, you would be tried by a British court, not by a Chinese court. So foreign powers effectively had control of these parts of China. Now, the thing though is, why was this actually so traumatic? Because if you look at the broad sweep of Chinese history, dynasties come and go. Right? So the fact that a dynasty is coming to its end, that's not anything unusual in Chinese history. In addition, it's not even unusual that foreigners would be behind the end of a dynasty. The Mongols had controlled China during the Yuan dynasty, and the Qing dynasty itself was not a native Chinese dynasty. It was a Manchu dynasty. It was a foreign dynasty. So why shouldn't people just say, oh, well, it's the end of a dynasty, that's a painful process, but there's nothing special going on. The problem this time was when the Mongols came in, when the Manchus came in, they became Sinicized. They adopted, to a great extent, Chinese culture. So up to this point, no one had fundamentally questioned the value or the success of Chinese civilization. But now the powers that were coming in and defeating China didn't believe in the same values and didn't believe in the same classic texts that China had believed in for more than 2,000 years. Skipping ahead a little bit, this is supposed to be Confucius, actually. And it's from a poster entitled The Evil Life of Confucius that was distributed during the Cultural Revolution, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I have if you email me, I have a link. A colleague has found this poster, and he has taken high-resolution photographs of each of the different scenes in the poster. It's really like a comic book in poster form. And it gives an alternative account of the life of Confucius, presenting him as an evil and ineffectual person. And so this is a picture of Confucius being this pathetic worshiper of irrelevancies from the past, as symbolized by the cobwebs. And although it dates from a later decade, it symbolizes this concern a lot of Chinese people have that, no, Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, they're all moribund. They're part of a past we have to abandon. Now, there were moderates in this debate, and in 1898 we have the 100 Days of Reform, when a bunch of reformers led by these guys, Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, tried to convert China into a modern constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom. And they pushed through, in a brief period of time, a bunch of reforms, including founding what later became the University of Peking University, Beijing Dashi. However, the reform movement was stopped by the Empress Dowager Cixi and a conservative faction at court. And there continues to be some historical debate. Generally, the Empress Dowager Cixi gets a bad rap as a reactionary who prevented China from modernizing when it had a last chance to do so before a cataclysm occurred. But there have been people who defended her and said actually she was the one behind the modernization, and these guys were a bunch of kooks who just temporarily gained the ear of the emperor. But in any case, the reform effort was squelched. Then Henry Bu Yi, the last Qing emperor, ascended to the throne as an infant. And you can tell there's no way that's going to work in a time of crisis. One of the sage kings would have had trouble saving China at this point, let alone an infant on the throne. So the Qing dynasty sputtered to an end in 1911, and the first president of China was Sun Zhongshan, who's better known in English as Sun Yat-sen, but he's considered the father of the country both by communists on the mainland in China and by the Republic of China on Taiwan. So he's universally revered. But his presidency didn't last very long. He was quickly replaced by this guy, a military general, Yuan Shikai. And then Yuan Shikai became president of China and then declared himself emperor. Deciding that the problem we had was that we had a Manchu emperor before, with an ethnically Chinese emperor, that will solve all of our problems. Now his dynasty doesn't even really count as a dynasty, it didn't survive, but it does show that even though the Qing dynasty ended in 1911, China was not yet on a firm political and social basis. So a lot of intellectuals decided at this point that the problem with China was traditional culture and it had to go. So you have what is sometimes called the New Culture movement, and these are two of the leading figures of it. This is Hu Shi on the left. He's a philosopher, a literary scholar, who's also a diplomat. He was ambassador to the United States for a while. He studied at, I think he studied at both Columbia and Cornell, if I'm not mistaken. And he actually won an award as an undergraduate for the best undergraduate essays. And by the best undergraduate essays, I mean he competed against people whose native language was English, and he wrote better English language essays than they did. And it's interesting, when you read, I read Hu Shi, the original Chinese, he's almost disappointing to read in the original Chinese because it reads like a really good native English speaker writing in Chinese. Because the sentence patterns just remind me of English sentence patterns. It's kind of like if I was on a really good day, what would I write in Chinese and what it would sound like? It doesn't sound like native Chinese. It's like he's totally absorbed the Western way of writing. But he wanted China to forget the old ways of the past and model itself on the liberal capitalistic democracies like the United States, France, and Great Britain. Lu Xun is the first great writer in the vernacular, as opposed to classical Chinese, the writing in Baihua, the vernacular. Lu Xun, I think he's the greatest Chinese writer of the 20th century personally, and I think had he lived longer, he might very well have won the Nobel Prize in literature. He's a terrific author. He's a little hard to pin down politically, except that he's very clear that all his stories reflect the fact that traditional culture is just completely corrupted from one end to the other. One of his most famous stories is Diary of a Madman, which is based on loosely on a short story by Gogol. But the theme of the story is that in the story, the narrator is insane and comes to believe that everybody in his neighborhood is a cannibal who's devouring other Chinese people. But it's one of those great stories where the person who's mad is the one who's actually sane, because he comes to realize that metaphorically everybody in society is devouring other people. And so he knows the truth in a deeper way than the people who are supposedly sane. So it's a great short story, and so he's another leading figure in this movement. But the problems for China weren't over. China joined the Allied side in World War I with the promise that the German-controlled portions of China would be returned to Chinese control at the end of the war. And at the end of the First World War, if you know the Treaty of Versailles, you know it was one of the worst treaties that anyone ever came up with in history. It laid the foundation, basically, of Nazism by crippling Germany so much that it created the conditions in which Nazism could flourish. Another stupid thing the Treaty of Versailles did was, so the Allies said, oh, of course, don't worry, we're taking those German territories in China away from Germany, don't you worry. We're going to give them to Japan instead. So when news of this got to China on May 4th, 1919, it started spontaneous demonstrations all across China. And it really radicalized a lot of people who already had concerns about the viability of Chinese culture. The motto of the May 4th movement, which you can see on one of these banners, is "Overturn the shop of Confucius," which means like just get rid of all the traditional thought. So people like Hu Shi and Lu Xun, who I just showed you, they were on the side of this movement as well. But the May 4th movement also leads to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party by these guys, Li Dazhao and Chen Zhushou. And you can understand what's motivating, right? So people like Hu Shi say, although there are problems with the United States and Great Britain and France and those countries, still they should be our model for a successful society. But people like Li Dazhao and Chen Zhushou said, those are the countries that gladly sold us out at the Treaty of Versailles. So we shouldn't be modeling ourselves on them, we should be modeling ourselves on the Soviet Union, which claims it's on the side of struggling countries that have been the victims of Western imperialism. So in the context, you can understand what they're doing, and this led to a major split in China and eventually a civil war between the Communist Party of China, which eventually founded the People's Republic of China, and the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, which continued the Republic of China, which had been founded right after the end of the Qing Dynasty. And in the early stage of the war, the nationalists beat the communists soundly. And so it got to the point where the communists had to make a huge retreat called famously the Long March. And they retreated just thousands of miles through almost impassable wilderness to escape being completely destroyed by the nationalists. And the nationalists, again, if you looked up until around 1937 or so, you would have said, well, communism's dead. Clearly, the nationalists are going to win. But then something else happened. Japan provoked war with China in 1937, leading to the second, with a kind of Eurocentric perspective where like, oh no, World War II starts in 1939. No, it starts in 1937 when Japan provokes war with China. And this map shows the greatest extent of Japanese control before the tide turned against Japan at the Battle of Midway in the Pacific. And a little historical side note, if I may. I know because my father actually fought in the Pacific Theater in World War II. But people of my father's generation, most of them really didn't want to fight in either Europe or in the Pacific. They thought, well, it's too bad Japan's defeating China. It's too bad the Nazis are taking over Europe, but that's not my problem. There are oceans separating us. Roosevelt realized there's no way we can let fascist states take over all of Europe and all over Asia. We got to stop that. But most Americans were in favor of it, and many Americans actually were quite sympathetic. Like Charles Lindbergh, famous for crossing the Atlantic single-handed, was a big admirer of Hitler and Mussolini. So that was actually the attitude at that time. But one of the things that FDR did was in his control as president is when Japan invaded what is now Vietnam, French Indochina, he froze Japanese assets in the United States. And that was a serious problem for the Japanese war machine, and he also cut off oil exports to Japan. Without oil and without those capital reserves, the Japanese military was in a lot of trouble. So the Japanese military decided, we'll launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and we'll just wipe out their aircraft carriers, and they'll be so decimated they'll immediately sue for peace. Now I'm just expressing my own opinion, obit or dicta here, but I think there's a good lesson here, which is when you kill people, their countrymen don't give up. They get more angry, and they want to kill your people. It's never a good strategy to think, well, we'll just kill a bunch of them and they'll immediately give up. Nobody does that. The United States didn't do that, nobody does that. So it was a huge miscalculation, and also, fortunately, the aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor when they attacked. So that would have been decimated. That would have been really decimated for the U.S. Navy, but they survived, and then everybody was happy to fight in World War II. So it actually completely changed things. There was immense amounts of damage and destruction. There's a famous newspaper photograph in Shanghai and a baby crying in the wreckage following Japanese bombing. And in fairness, I don't have a grudge against any people in the world, but we have to face historical facts. There were a lot of atrocities committed by the invading Japanese army, a lot of targeting of civilians, systematic rape of women. So it was a very nasty, very bloody attack, and again, many Chinese died. Now, eventually, of course, Japan is defeated in 1945, and the Civil War starts up again. The nationalists and the communists agreed to a ceasefire during the war. And I hear different views about this when I go to China. So some people in China tell me, they say, well, what happened was the nationalists did all the fighting against the Japanese, so they were decimated in the war. So when the Civil War started over again, the communists who had been doing nothing were really strong, and so they won the Civil War. Other historians say, no, it really could have gone either way. It was like any other war. There's strategic mistakes each side makes, and the person who made the last mistake loses. It's a famous saying about warfare. The loser is the one who makes the last mistake. So, and I'm expert on that. But in any case, in 1949, Mao Zedong is shown here addressing the throng of people in Tiananmen Square in thousands of people's Republic of China. So this is part of the background against which you have to understand the later reception and views towards Chinese thought. Now, after Mao gets in power, Mao was undoubtedly a genius at military tactics, and the guerrilla warfare tactics he pioneered, which were in direct opposition to what the Soviet advisors to the Chinese communists were telling them to do. The Soviet advisors were saying, fight a big conventional war head on with the nationalists. That's what they tried to do. That's how they got decimated. And Mao's like, no, we're going to fight guerrilla warfare. Hit and run, hit and run, hit and run. As long as the guerrilla doesn't lose, he wins. That's a bit of a remarkably successful strategy, and Mao is a genius for coming up with that. But he was frankly an idiot about a lot of other things. One of the things he came up with was the Great Leap Forward. This is a propaganda poster for the Great Leap Forward. In the Great Leap Forward, the idea was we're going to collectivize all the farms. So we're going to bring all the farmers together. They're going to eat in communal kitchens. We're going to plant plants twice as densely as before. Because what do farmers know about farming? Nothing. So we'll just plant the plants twice as densely as the farmers have been planting for 2,000 years. Oh, and also we're going to build steel in backyard furnaces. So people are going to take all the iron they have and they're going to throw it into backyard furnaces and turn it into steel. Now, spoiler, you can't make steel in a backyard furnace. You need super high temperatures and you need to blast oxygen into it. And ironically, in the Middle Ages, Chinese people, blacksmiths knew how to make steel. They knew how hard it was, but Mao didn't know this. So what happened was massive starvation because the planting and the disruption of the farmlands. And also a lot of farm implements were ruined by being melted in backyard furnaces. And people were initially afraid to tell Mao what was happening because they were afraid Mao would have them killed for telling them the truth about the starvation. In fact, they gave Mao inflated reports of how much grain the farms were producing. And Mao read those accounts and said, oh, wow, we're producing so much grain, we can export it to other countries. And so he started exporting grain to other countries, increasing the starvation. Now, this is a propaganda poster about how wonderful the Great Leap Forward is. And the reason it looks so weird is it's modeled on a famous image of Xian immortals crossing the sea. And if you go to, I don't know if you see this ever here in South Africa, but a lot of Chinese restaurants I've been to in the US, they'll have an image of the seven immortals crossing the sea. And it looks kind of like this, except it's not tractors and missiles and farmers, it's immortals. And so it's modeled on that, but it's supposed to be, the Great Leap Forward is going really well. It wasn't going really well, it was going terribly. Eventually people realized what was happening and they started to push Mao out of power. He was always going to be important, his life was never in danger, but he wasn't going to be the paramount leader anymore. That's when Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. And he called on students to drop out of school, all college students, but in some cases, high school students, I understand in some cases, grade school students, just to drop out of school and rout out all the vestiges of feudalism and capitalism in Chinese society. And as you can imagine, they had all the mercy of the Spanish Inquisition and all the subtle inquiry of the Salem witch trials in the United States as they rooted out people who were allegedly feudalists or capitalists. And Mao set this up, and everybody who had opposed him was sent to prison as being a capitalist sympathizer or as being an agent of feudalism or just not listening enough to Mao. And to give you a sense of what it was like, this is a stele, a memorial tablet in Chufu, Confucius's hometown. And it's a little hard to see, but they've left the graffiti on it so that people will remember what happened in the Cultural Revolution, because Red Guards, those students who had dropped out of school, wrote on this memorial tablet to Confucius, "Revolution is not a crime. Coming its way." I also, I don't know the slide in here, but at a visit to China a few years ago, I ran across a professor of German literature, a Chinese professor of German literature. And he started talking to me, and he was a really old guy. And he showed me his hands, and there were some scars on his hand. He says, "You know how I got these?" He said, "During the Cultural Revolution, they said I was a spy." I said, "Why did they say that?" I said, "Well, because I studied abroad. That was it. So I must be a spy because I studied abroad. I studied in Germany." And so they wanted me to confess, but I wouldn't confess because I wasn't a spy. So they took nails and they drove them into my hand. And that's how I got these scars. But he said proudly, "But I didn't confess." And so I said, "I'll always tell people this story. I'll always tell people your story. when I have occasion to. And so I always mention, I have a picture of him somewhere. I assume he's passed away. He was like, 800 years old at that point. So, but I don't want to flash his picture around just in case. So Mao had the only person in China who was really safe. And this is a propaganda poster showing Mao surrounded by admiring students waving his Little Red Book, which is a collection of Mao's sayings, like little brief aphorisms or paragraph-long selections from his writings. I have a copy of it at home in the original Chinese. And actually, the version I have of the Little Red Book is actually kind of a collector's item because it's got selections from this guy in it. And so I know it was produced in like a couple of year period in between when this guy became really important and when he was purged. And so it's like that, it only has to date from those couple of years because you wouldn't have had him in there anyway. Now, so let's think about this. So this is Mao's Little Red Book. In English we say quotations from Chairman Mao. Literally, it's recorded sayings of Chairman Mao. Let's compare that to, this is the Analects of Confucius, literally the categorized sayings of Master Kong. What a coincidence, huh? So Mao had placed himself in the position of a sage like Confucius by distributing a collection, his Analects, his collected sayings. And so he was now the great sage, the one who understood everything, and you could trust him completely with unlimited power. But although there's that formal similarity, there are important content differences between Confucianism and Maoism. Confucius says in the Analects, the virtue of a gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of the petty person is like the grass. When the wind moves over the grass is sure to bend. In other words, if you're a virtuous person, your moral charisma will sway others and make them want to follow you naturally. You won't have to coerce them. And what does Mao say? Every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So, similar structurally works, but very different in content. Now, Mao finally passes away in 1976, and one of the people who had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping, comes into power. And he leads China in a much more moderate direction. And part of the reason, as Dilip was pointing out last time, I partly got interested in China because of the terrific movie Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. But also, again, 76, I was in high school, and there was a real interest in China because China had suddenly opened up to the West again and was instituting these market reforms led by Deng Xiaoping. And these led to huge changes in China almost overnight. So this is a view of Shanghai's Pudong district from 1987. So watch that. Same place, 2013. So 87, 2013. Pretty amazing, right? Now, as China has changed remarkably in economic terms, there's been a real change in attitudes towards Confucius as well. As I said before, there were like posters condemning Confucius during the Cultural Revolution. He was part of the feudal past, and people would desecrate the Confucian relics to express their contempt for him. Deng Xiaoping was at least tolerant of Confucianism, but the current Chinese government is actually encouraging of it. And the Chinese people seem hungry for positive portrayals of Confucius. And that's reflected in the fact that this book, Confucius from the Heart, is of course originally written in Chinese, is an English translation, but by Professor Yu Dan. She published this book and it became a surprise bestseller. I mean, as it says there on the cover, like 10 million copies in print. And when it says 10 million copies in print, it means 10 million legal copies and 20 million pirated copies easily. So, and honestly, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk about it, it's not a deep account of Confucius. But what's interesting is it's a positive account. And people are really hungry to read it. Yeah, we want to have a positive account of Confucius. We don't want to condemn it. The Chinese government is getting in on the act. I have this stamp at home. It's from the series Ancient Thinkers, and that's Kongzi Confucius. And of course, as we know, we have Confucius institutes all over the world. putting Confucius on a stamp, trading on his name, these are things the government would never have done in China under Mao. Even President Xi Jinping is getting in on the act. This is a real book. It's in Chinese and in English, How to Read Confucius and the Other Chinese Classics. I have it in Chinese and English at home. Again, not a deep interpretation of the classics by any means. And in my book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, I have a section where I talk about Xi Jinping's appropriation of Confucianism. And what I say is, Xi Jinping's appropriation of Confucianism is a lot like the way many politicians in the US appropriate Christianity. It's a tool for nationalism and for getting political success. It's not something that they're really using to shape their lives or challenge their lives. President Trump, is allegedly, has been embraced by conservative Christians in the United States. He gave a talk at a religious institution, I think it was Liberty University in the United States, and he said, yeah, I hear you guys are really big on 2 Corinthians. And if you know the Christian Bible, it's not called 2 Corinthians, it's called 2 Corinthians. And so he's never even heard of the books of the Bible. And then people said, okay, what's your favorite Bible verse? And he said, never bend to envy. That is not in the Bible. Right? That's like a borderline, like, no, you can just look it up. It's not in any it's not in the Bible. And so he just made it up. Nobody cares. So Xi Jinping's appropriation of Confucianism is similarly opportunistic. Part of what motivates it is China is a Marxist country in name only. Every college or university, every university, they don't have colleges, every university in China has to have courses offered in Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and now Xi Jinping thought as well. And so it's got to be offered, it has to be taught. Almost nobody takes it seriously. Why? Because they look around them and they see China's a raging capitalist economy. And that's what it is. It's beginning to be a problem for Xi Jinping, and this is a general thing, and I point this out in my book as well. There's a danger with telling students to read the classics. If you tell them to read the classics, they might actually do it and pay attention. So you tell people to read Confucius, who says that you have to rule by inspiration, not by the threat of violence. Your students might just start to believe that. And if you tell students that government is about preventing rich capitalists from exploiting poor workers, some of them are actually going to believe that and start protesting the treatment of low-wage workers in China, and that's what started to happen. They're being immediately, as they used to say about people in Latin America, disappeared. They disappear, and then if they show up again later at all, it's bruised and beaten, giving confessions at a show trial. But resistance is starting to build. So China isn't really a Marxist or communist country anymore, so people need something to believe in. Xi Jinping thinks this will give China something to unify us as the Han people, the Chinese people. Incidentally, Xi Jinping's father was a leading figure in the Communist Party who was purged during the Cultural Revolution. So in terms of attitudes towards traditional Chinese thought, we have 4 general responses to the crisis that was occasioned by the fall of the Qing and imperialism on the part of the European powers in Japan, and the seeming failure of traditional modes of thought. You've got liberalism, which says, yeah, we just got to become like the Western powers. Adopt Western science, Western democracy, read the Western classics, use the Western methods for studying our own classics. Import their methods of doing archaeology and textual research, all those things. And Hu Shi is perhaps the paradigmatic figure in this movement. Then you got the communists who said, no, capitalism is the system that sold us out, and it's the system of the imperialists. We want to be on the side of the people who want to liberate those imperialists. Didn't work out that way under Mao. The peasants starved, and pretty much everybody suffered except for Mao himself. But that was at least the motive that led the original idealistic Maoists to follow Mao. And then, of course, we've got a kind of, what you might call Confucian communism under Xi Jinping. As I just said, I think it's mostly opportunistic. There was a really interesting communist thinker, Liu Shaoqi, who was a leading member of the party. He also thought that you should supplement Marxist teachings with Confucian theories about ethical cultivation. And he had this brilliant insight. Remember, according to Marxism, your worldview is conditioned by your economic relations of production. But, Liu Shaoqi said, depending on what part of China we're from, we are either born in a feudal society, so we have a feudal mindset, or if we were born in a major city, or and our parents are factory workers or something, we have a bourgeois mindset. Neither one of these is a communist mindset. So how do we develop a communist mindset? He said, we have to use Confucian cultivation techniques to transform our mindset into a Confucian, into a Marxist communist mindset. And he used lines from the Confucian classics to illustrate this. He also went out of his way to say, of course the Confucians were wrong because their cultivation is idealistic, whereas our Marxist cultivation is materialist, which is like a classic Marxist thing to say. But still, it's a brilliant synthesis. He's not as well known in the West, in part because A, Mao purged him, and he died under mysterious circumstances in prison. But B, there is an English translation of Liu Shaoqi's masterwork, but it was translated into the English title of How to Be a Good Communist. You can find it online. There's a famous Marxist collective website of translations into English of Marxist works. It's really very impressive. And it's got this in there. It's not a bad translation, except that's a stupid title. How to Be a Good Communist. I think it's got to be a joke. The actual Chinese title is 论工厂当员的修养, which is on the ethical cultivation of Communist Party members, which sounds pretty interesting. That's what it's about. So he should be studied more. And he was a sincere Marxist, which is why probably Mao had him killed. As like Xi Jinping's Confucian communism is really just kind of opportunistic. So among the people who really take traditional Chinese thought seriously, one of the major movements has been what is called New Confucianism. And this guy, Mo Zongsan, is one of the major figures in that movement. The New Confucians in 1958, January 1st, 1958, they published this manifesto on behalf of Chinese culture. It's actually longer, the title's longer than that. It's a manifesto on behalf of Chinese culture respectfully presented to the people of the world. And it's been an immensely influential work. It's sometimes called the New Confucian Manifesto because the movement associated with these guys is called New Confucianism. Not to be confused with Neo-Confucianism, which is a movement that started in the Song Dynasty in China. And just to make matters confusing, New Confucianism is very influenced by Neo-Confucianism, but Neo-Confucianism is a traditional Chinese system of thought. New Confucianism is the 20th and 21st century revival of Confucianism. And in this manifesto, I think there's 5 authors. Mo Zongsan and Tang Zhenyi are the most famous and influential of them. And they make several claims about the fundamental differences between Chinese and Western civilizations. The New Confucians admit, they say, look, in China, we have to learn modern science. You know, we had some antecedents of science in our tradition, but the West has really perfected natural science. We have to learn that from the West. We have to learn some version of democratic government from the West. Some of them even said, Li Dajiao, who was a Marxist, said this, but also some new Confucians had said, we have to learn feminism from the West. Women's rights have to be protected to a greater extent than they were in traditional Chinese culture. But they say there are certain things that are superior about Chinese culture, and we should preserve those, and the West could stand to learn from them. This is an immensely influential movement, and it's a very seductive document. And I'm going to warn you that at Yale and US, we stopped teaching this in our required 2-semester philosophy sequence. We stopped teaching the manifesto. Why? Because students were buying it hook, line, and sinker uncritically. right? They read Plato and they were like, oh, Plato's really cool, but they don't uncritically buy Plato or Aristotle or Zhuangzi or Mengzi or anybody. But this, they're like, oh yeah, that's it. That's totally explained everything in the universe to me. So we're just like, we got to stop teaching it. I mean, they're not thinking critically enough about it. So what is it that I think is interesting but also problematic about it? Well, in part 6 of the Manifesto, they say that both Chinese and Western critics of Chinese traditional culture, like the people in the May 4th movement and the Western critics of traditional Chinese culture, have failed to appreciate what's really distinctive of Chinese culture. And this is the equation of the pattern of nature with the pattern of heaven and one's original mind with the mind of the universe. So it's a kind, what they're describing is a kind of moderate monism. Right? It's not the kind of extreme monism in which of the night in which all cows are black, to coin a phrase. You know, it's a more nuanced monism where there's differentiation among things, but those things at some level have an underlying unity. And that's the pattern of nature being the same as the pattern of heaven, and one's original mind being the mind of the universe. And as I say, somewhat confusingly, this is very similar to what Neo-Confucians, as they're called in the West, like Zhu Xi, who lived in the 12th century of the Common Era, said. So Zhu Xi, this is a guy from the Song Dynasty, he says, there's only one overarching pattern within heaven and earth. Human nature is just the pattern. So the structure of the universe is your nature. They're the same. I could go on forever about how they get this notion. It's really fascinating what it means. But this is what they identify. Say this is what's distinctive of Chinese culture, this kind of moderate monism. And they suggest that the West can learn a bunch of things from sometimes they say Asia, sometimes they say China, sometimes they say Far East. It's a document written by a committee, so it's not entirely consistent. But they say anyway, the West can learn to become empty. Now, emptiness is a technical term in Buddhist thought, and they're influenced in their use of this term by Buddhist thought. But in the Manifesto, what they seem to mean by being empty is approaching things without preconceptions, so that you can judge them more objectively and with less bias. So they say this is something that Eastern can teach the West, is to become empty, free of preconceptions. The East can teach the West a rounded and spiritual wisdom, as opposed to the square wisdom of the West. Now, what does rounded and spiritual wisdom as opposed to square wisdom mean? By square wisdom, they mean the wisdom that comes from applying precisely defined rules in an algorithmic way. Rounded and spiritual wisdom is a flexible wisdom, where you know when to bend the rule or when to break the rule. So I love Singapore. I'm teaching in Singapore now, and I tell everybody how much I love Singapore, and I really do. But they've inherited from British colonial days just obsession with rules and regulations. And so there's just like, you just have to fill out these forms and you have to go through these regulations. One of the things I love about going to China is there's 1,000 rules and regulations. Nobody really cares about them, as long as you're not making any trouble. You're just like, I'm not supposed to do this, can I do that? And it's like, yeah, you like to go ahead, yeah, whatever. So people are very laid back about all kinds of things. And so it's just like, yeah, don't worry about the rule. I suppose I shouldn't say this, but like there's a rule that you're supposed to, so everybody in a department, in an academic unit is supposed to give their passports to the departmental administrator. So you're supposed to hold on to them for some reason. And like one place I taught, the administrator said, I'm not going to do that. What if I lost them? It's like, I'll have a file that would be where they would go if I had them. And we'll keep that, but you hold on to them. And if they do an inspection, we can put them in the file, but I'm not going to hold on to them. Like, that's so Chinese. I'm just like, yeah, love that. That's great. And the West can learn mildness and empathy as opposed to Western passion and love. So the idea here is that the claim is that mildness and empathy, compassion in the Chinese tradition is genuinely selfless. because it's based on this belief that there's an underlying unity between ourselves and others. Whereas Western passion and love are ultimately selfish because they're predicated upon the existence of separate individuals. So even when you're showing someone love, it's ultimately a selfish kind of love. Oops, sorry. The wrong thing. The West can also learn from the East to replenish one's spiritual strength through the underlying source of life in the universe. In other words, instead of having a transcendent God who doesn't interact with you, because the pattern of the universe is inside you, you have an endless repository of spiritual energy which you can draw on at any time. And when you recognize that spiritual power is there, you can avoid nihilism. And so we were talking a little bit about, in my last talk, about nihilism. And so part of the response to the challenge of nihilism in the West is they say, well, the reason you guys are facing the challenge of nihilism is your conception of God is this radically transcendent being, when God is really inside you. And that's how you overcome nihilism, recognizing that God is inside you. And they say that the West can learn from China to consider every human as part of one family instead of thinking of people as distinct individuals. Now, like I say, the Manifesto, and these are two more authors of the Manifesto, Xu Fuguang and Zhang Junmai. There's a fifth author. He's so obscure I can't find a picture of him. And so I would love to get a picture of him, but as I say, Mo Zhongsan and Tang Juni, those are the really famous guys. They're like, if you can trace your intellectual ancestry back to Tang Juni and Mo Zhongsan, you're made. You're really made. It's like, that's the cool thing. If you can say, oh yeah, well, I'm a student of a student of a student of Mo Zhongsan, that's really good credentials. People really do that. They'll trace themselves back to these guys. So again, it's a fascinating work, and it's, as I say, really seductive. You read it, and it really makes you want to believe it. It's really problematic in a lot of ways. And I'm just going to touch on some of the issues that I think exist with it. First, the Manifesto argues that a weakness of the West is its tendency to assume abstract criteria, prejudices, and habitual opinions for evaluating others. And the relevance of this diagram over here is it's just a really cool Neo-Confucian diagram, and so it's a nice visual. That's all. It's just a cool visual. And I could say something about it's a really important diagram. It's the diagram that's the supreme ultimate, but it's just there because it's really cool. So, but that's what the Manifesto says. Like, the problem with the Westerners is abstract criteria, their prejudices, their habitual opinions for evaluating others. Isn't the Manifesto doing this itself through its abstract list of contrasting strengths and weaknesses of the West and the East? And so Edward Said, as I'm sure you know, has this landmark work, Orientalism. And it's organized around this idea that going back even as far as like Herodotus and Thucydides in the West, Westerners have thought of this huge heterogeneous region of the world as all being the Orient and all having the same abstract characteristics. But as some people have pointed out, and that's clearly wrong because it's subsuming very diverse people under abstract categories. But you can also have a kind of Occidentalism where you do the same thing to the West and you say, well, everybody in the West has these characteristics. But that's equally a kind of using abstract criteria and prejudices for evaluating the other. The Manifesto claims that Chinese thinkers across history share the same learning of the mind and nature. That is to say, this view that your nature is the same as the power of the universe. In fact, Confucian, Taoists, and Buddhists have substantially different views on metaphysics, political philosophy, and ethics, and they've argued insistently over these things through Chinese history. I was just at a great talk in which the speaker was criticizing the, what was the phrase, unanimism, the view that all African thinkers think the same. He said that's unanimism. And he says that's ridiculous. I mean, not everybody in Africa thinks the same, or even if we localize it to a particular culture, cultures are disputed. And so it's not like everybody in Ghana thinks the same way, or everybody in Nigeria thinks the same way. The same thing about China. It's a culture that's 3,000 years old, and it's always been contested. All Confucians don't agree. Confucians argue vehemently over what the meaning of the Confucian tradition is. The manifesto claims that Western thinkers regard metaphysics as separate from ethics and regard God as something totally transcendent of the self. Actually, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Hobbes have integrated metaphysics and ethics. And all the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, regard God as simultaneously transcendent and immanent. That's a standard thing to say in all of the Abrahamic faiths. That God does transcend us, but as Augustine puts it, God knows me better than I know myself because he's always within me. Whereas Ibn Tufayl puts it in Hay Ibn Yaqzan, we're all like mirrors of the supreme light that is God. And we're most real when we're most like God. So, although it's a really seductive work and it's been immensely influential, the manifesto provides the conceptual framework for so much of what counts as Confucianism today. I think it's a very problematic work. So when we look at the history, again, of 20th century Chinese thought, we find, and this continues to the present day, there are people, I've met thinkers in China who say Confucius is irrelevant to the future of China. We're basically going to become, some of them think, not as many of them as you might, well, yeah, maybe you're more sophisticated than this. In the United States, everybody tends to assume that everybody in the world wants to become like the United States. And I spend a lot of time saying, no, everybody in China doesn't want to become just like the United States. But there are a lot of people who say the future, one way or the other, is going to involve getting rid of the past. There are a minority of students who are reading Marxism and taking it seriously. They're called the New Left in China, and they're protesting against the government's policies allowing the exploitation of poor workers. So far, they just disappear overnight. But that may become a long-term issue in China. And you may at some point develop people who will take Liu Shaoqi's ideas and synthesize Marxism and Confucianism again, but the government use of Confucianism now is largely symbolic and opportunistic. The real form that Confucianism has taken is typically that dictated by the new Confucians, but as people get interested in Confucianism and study it more, I think there's really a potential for more growth and development of new forms of Confucianism. And what it really comes down to is, are we going to have a future in which some version, this is a statue of Confucius, some version of Confucianism is a highly respected part of Chinese tradition, or are we going to have some version in which Confucius is consigned to the dustbin of history? Personally, Confucianism, I've noticed that Confucianism has survived in multiple cultures, over 2,500 years, so I suspect it's got another 2,500 years left to go. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Actually what strikes me is that when one thinks about the enormously subtle reflections on ethics, personhood, politics that you talked about in the first lecture, and what we now have from what you presented, that is a very instrumentalist use of philosophy in order to contrast China with the West, contrast China's modernity with other forms of modernity and so on. So what happens to that earlier tradition of thinking? Does it still survive? Are there philosophers, in the sense that we understand philosophy, who are not only thinking about philosophy in terms of the nation state, thinking about it as an intellectual entity?
Yeah. Well, just to give you a sense of the intellectual landscape, I was at a conference in China a few years ago, and I was the only foreigner at this philosophy conference, and the Chinese participants were approximately evenly divided into people doing Western-style philosophy, either analytic or continental, people doing some kind of Chinese philosophy, a lot of which, to be honest, was fairly philological, as opposed to properly philosophical. And then the Marxist philosophers. And no group seemed to take either of the other groups very seriously, unfortunately. So Western-trained philosophers in China often look down on people who do Chinese philosophy. People who do Chinese philosophy often look down on people who do Western-style philosophy. as I say, a lot of what passes for philosophy right now in China, when it comes to Chinese philosophy, is more like philology or history, etymology, things like that. But you do have people who are taking it seriously. For example, there's a thinker, Zhang Qing, and his works aren't always freely available in China, but people know about him, and he's got a lot of attention outside China. Monarchy. Kind of a constitutional monarchy, but he would have a tricameral house, and the tricameral house would have only one house that is elected by the people. The other two would either be hereditary figures or figures who were appointed or got into the position by examination. And so it would be meritocratic or hereditary. And again, he's not really central to political debates, but there are people who take him seriously. And you do have a handful of thinkers who, like Li Ziho, is a really interesting Chinese thinker. Kind of hard to classify. Sometimes people call him a Marxist. He's very interested in this, but he's also very interested in aesthetic theories, and he's not certainly a standard kind of Maoist thinker. So you do have a handful of thinkers who are doing really interesting work, but I still think things in China are in a very transitional period right now, and things haven't entirely recovered either from the Cultural Revolution or from the authoritarianism of Xi Jinping, which is trying to limit freedom of thought. And it's hard to have a viable philosophical dialogue in that kind of environment. On the other hand, as you and I were saying over lunch, if you look historically, some of the best philosophy comes out when people are fighting oppression and are fighting difficult circumstances. So that's when people are really forced to think hard about what is government authority, what is right, what is wrong, what stance do I have to take. When I've been giving classes in China, what I found is many of my students, for example, I've taught Anglo-Confucian political philosophy, and I found that when I do that, my students are a lot more interested many times in the Anglo-European political philosophy than they are in the Confucian political philosophy, because they're looking for ways to think about how to get human rights or how to ensure things like freedom of speech or freedom of association. And that often interests them more than the Confucian ideas. So, and I've been one of the reasons that I often end up going to China is I've been invited there by some philosophers in the hopes of helping to invigorate the dialogue on Chinese philosophy, because ironically they find that the people outside China sometimes are having a more vigorous dialogue about Chinese philosophy than some people inside China. They're hoping to jumpstart the discussion by getting me involved. Say this weird situation where the kid from Latrobe, Pennsylvania is in the People's Republic of China lecturing on Confucianism because Chinese people brought him in because they thought, well, you're more interesting than the people who were talking about Confucianism to us, at least right now. So it's not a great situation, but I think there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential. Or whoever.
You go 1, 2, 3.
Yes, thanks very much.
Sure.
Absolutely fascinating. I know only the bare minimum about Confucianism, but something I've always understood about it is that it's a big part of it promotes order, continuity, respect for authority. So this seems in some ways quite an easy fit how an authoritarian can evoke Confucius for their own purposes, and how revolutionaries would be anti.
Yeah, that's a legitimate point, and in fairness, historically, part of the reason that Confucianism became successful in Korea and then in Japan was that it had government support because they recognized that it was a system that can easily be used to support conformity. But if you look at the history of Confucianism, the thing is, and this is what I keep coming back to, if you make kids read the classics, it's dangerous because they're going to read them carefully. And Confucius himself he's paternalistic, like everybody in ancient China is, but he's not authoritarian. Confucius says government has to be for the well-being of the common people. And Mengzi, who's a later Confucian, says explicitly that if the people aren't happy, that's proof that heaven has taken the mandate to rule away from the government, and that it's going to be given to somebody else who will make the people happy. And the test of whether you've got the mandate to rule is whether or not the people are fundamentally happy. And this aspect of Mengzi's thought, the claim that you can overthrow a government that people don't like, was actually excised from Mengzi's writings when they got to Japan, because the government didn't want people to hear that. There's also, you get figures in the Confucian tradition like Wang Yangming. And Wang Yangming famously says, the 10,000 sages are passing shadows. It is pure knowing that it is my God. And so he's saying that inside you, because after all, the pattern of heaven is the pattern inside you, he says, you've got the truth inside you, you just have to follow it. And he says he's willing to even disagree with Confucius if he thinks Confucius is wrong. He adds, I've never found Confucius to be wrong. But he says the thing you have to follow is your own conscience. And again, I'm not dumping on Japan, but when that was something that was excised from accounts of Wang Yangming, when Wang Yangming was introduced to Japan, this notion that you had to follow your conscience, even against what authority figures said. So like every other tradition, you find elements of conformism in the tradition, and this allows it to be appropriated by authoritarian forces. But any interesting tradition, you also find these countervailing forces, and you do find that in Confucianism. So the more people read Confucianism, they're going to find this history of people like the people in the 100 Days of Reform, who I showed earlier in the slide. These guys were consciously inspired by Confucianism, and they were trying to reform Chinese government in terms of ideas they had learned from Confucianism. And again, they had a new spin on what those ideas were, but again, that's part of tradition too. Part of tradition is arguing over what the significance of the tradition is. So who is next? So,
Colette and the gentleman at the back.
Unless they're all reading Confucius from the heart.
yeah.
There was something that perplexed me. I think it was in the Manifesto. I'm very perplexed by your students' enthusiasm for it. I think it was the 5th point. I can't remember exactly the wording, but I was looking at and thinking about kind of Han chauvinism or the ethnostate and the peculiarity of the wording, and I just couldn't quite understand what that was getting at.
Was it maybe, so this is the...
About the oneness of...
Oh yeah, maybe this slide then, yeah, so the...
no, sorry, after that. So I think it was on, like part 11, after part... So yeah, the part 11 slide, the second one. So the next slide? Yes. To consider every human as part of one family.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Confucian ideas of the family, but I'm thinking about China as a sort of an ethno-state, and then communist concerns about that. And I wondered if there's a history there that I'm not getting.
Yeah, this is good question, right? This is fascinating. Part of what happens is Confucianism, as you know, has always emphasized the importance of the family as both the nursery of the virtues. The idea being that it's in the family that you learn to be benevolent through loving others in the family. It's in the family you learn to have integrity by respecting others in the family. And then they think the family creates these special obligations, like your obligation to care for your parents more than other elders, my obligation to care for my own children more than other people's children. So that's always been a part of Confucianism. What happens is Buddhism comes into China, and the particular spin that Buddhism develops in China is that it becomes a form of monism, in which you've got a self, which is going to sound really weird to anybody who knows Indian Buddhism. But the idea in Chinese Buddhism, like Huayan Buddhism, is you've got a self, but it's a transpersonal, universal self. So in the words of Huayan Buddhism, one is all and all is one. Then Confucians react against Buddhism. But by the time they react against Buddhism, Chinese culture has been steeped in these Buddhist ideas for centuries. So the Confucian reaction against Buddhism, which is called Neo-Confucianism in English, or Daoxue in Chinese, has absorbed all these Buddhist ideas. So they reformulate Confucianism in terms of this notion that there's an underlying identity that everything in the universe shares. But then they say, well, the Buddhists are close, but they don't recognize that although there's this underlying unity, there really are distinct individuals. And so I'm an individual who owes something to my parents as individuals, and that's real. But nonetheless, my nature is the nature of the universe, and your nature is the nature of the universe. So they start talking in terms about everything being one body, or everything being one substance, which I think are things you wouldn't find Confucius or his earlier followers like monks saying, but it becomes part of the common vocabulary in the later Confucian movement. Now the new Confucians they're not Daoxue, they're not Neo-Confucians, but they've been influenced by those ideas. So when they're formulating their position, they said, you got to recognize that everybody in the universe, not just Chinese, but people all over the world, and indeed everything in the universe, has this universal aspect to itself. So I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Hero, Inshon, by Zhang Yimou. It's a great film. It's definitely worth a watch. But at the end, there's, this is kind of a spoiler, but don't worry, there's plenty of good stuff in the movie, even with the spoiler. At the end, a character, in trying to tell somebody what they should do, draws characters in the sand. And we later learn that the characters are Tianxia, which is literally under the heavens, meaning the entire world. And there's been a lot of debate over the significance of that. And some people read that in a really nationalistic way. And they read it like, well, it's about how the Chinese can control everything. Like all under heaven will belong to China. And some other people say, no, Tianxia, when it's used in Chinese history, normally just refers to China. And so it's nationalistic, but it's nationalistic in a different way. It's just about a lot of people. But other people say, no, Tianxia means the whole world. And so it means you have to act for the benefit of the whole world, not just yourself or your family or your state or your ethnicity. And that ambiguity is reflected in these Confucian ideas, that they can be put in the service of nationalistic notions, but ultimately what they mean is all humans are one, and that is an inspiring idea. And so any human you are, you've got the same nature. People don't do this much anymore, but occasionally I do get challenged by people saying, where do you get off explaining Confucianism when you're a white guy from Western Pennsylvania? I don't get that too often, but sometimes I get it. And then what I do, I just say, at one point Confucius got so sick of how bad things were in China that he said, I'm just going to go off and join the barbarians. And one of his disciples says, oh, the barbarians are so uncouth. How could you join the barbarians? And he said, if a gentleman lived among them, they wouldn't be uncouth anymore. Yeah, exactly, yeah. And that's that. I just say, so I'm one of those barbarians, and the spirit of Confucius came and flew over me, and so now I'm not uncouth anymore. And that's why Confucianism could spread beyond the borders of China, and it could be adopted in Korea, in Vietnam, and in Japan, and in widespread communities across the world, because it's not tied to an ethnicity, and it's got a universalistic aspect to it.
Thank you. How do you think that the Fourth Industrial Revolution impacts upon both present and future Chinese philosophical thought?
The Fourth Industrial Revolution, yeah. Well, I think we're seeing this already. So there's what's called, and it's called this in China as well, the Great Firewall of China, which is the effort of the Chinese government to prevent people from accessing the internet. But at least, I don't know if I've heard that it's getting harder to do, but my experience every time I go to China is you show up in China and one of your Chinese friends says, oh, let me hook you up with something to get around the Great Firewall. So everybody who's got access to a computer knows how to get around government firewalls. But what that means is everybody in China who knows how to use their computer can access news reports and opinion pieces from outside China. They can access the Chinese edition of the New York Times, of which there is one. And so they can read all these dissident voices. And they can also read foreign accounts of Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism, and they can learn about what people are saying. And there's an increasing hunger to translate these things. Like, 2 of my books have already been translated into Chinese and are going to be coming out in the next few years. Just last week, somebody else wrote me and said, we'd like to translate another one of your books. And so a bunch of English language and other European language books about Chinese thought and culture are being translated into Chinese to make them more accessible to Chinese readers, because there's a hunger to see what are other people saying about these traditions and what can we learn about our own traditions by studying it with others. Again, you still do occasionally get this ethnocentric kind of well, we Chinese, we don't think this way. Occasionally I'll hear that. But usually people are more open-minded. They're like, no, it's just, we can, there's this great line in the philosopher W.V.O. Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine. I read, for weird reasons, I read a lot of Quine growing up. If you know who Quine is, a philosopher of language, very big in the 50s and 60s in the US. And at one point, he's got a big discussion of radical translation, of translating a language when you don't know anything about the language yet. And at one point he says, you gradually develop these interpretive hypotheses, and you fill in more and more hypotheses until you get to the point where he says, if you disagree with a native, you argue with him like a brother. And that was a really interesting line, and it's both inspiring but also problematic, because Quine ignores the political dimensions of these debates. But there is a sense in which I can sometimes, when I'm in China, argue with the native like a brother, and I can just say, well, I'm a Confucian too, I don't read it that way. Here's the text, here's how I would read this, I would say this way. The person I'm talking to could say, well, I would read it that way. But that really is something that the Chinese tradition, in particular, really all the forms of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism ultimately are committed to. They're not ethnocentric philosophies in their essence. They can be appropriated for that, but ultimately their principles are supposed to be universalistic.
Is it possible to get out?
Yes.
We'll let you out. I just want to ask a question about stepping beside what appears to be the dominant, hegemonic understanding of what constitutes thinking, where thought comes from, and so on. Because if one looks at contemporary China, and if one looks at ancient China, so for example, if you look at Mark Elvin's book on Retreat of the Elephants, there's a strong tradition of environmentalism or preserving the ecology among Chinese bureaucrats.
Yeah.
And you have a huge tradition of that.
Yeah.
In contemporary China, there are movements for protecting the environment, the gay and lesbian movements, and multiple things that are happening. So I wonder whether they are drawing upon only what comes from the West, right? So the internet, so you would see the internet as the portal to the West. Or are they also drawing upon traditions of thinking which are present in China, which don't necessarily lead them into the arid space of what we're talking about here?
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's we see this in a variety of perspectives. So in Confucian texts, even as early as the Mengzi, which is 4th century BCE, he's writing about environmental issues and about the dangers of exhausting natural resources. In my other talk, I talked about the Ox Mountain parable. That's not primarily an environmental metaphor, but the reason it works is he's thinking about environmental issues. And in another text, he says specifically things like, you have to limit the size of the nets that are used so you don't get the young fish and turtles, so you don't exhaust the land. You have to plant things in a way that's sustainable. So there's a concern with sustainable agriculture. And then Taoism, which again can take various forms, but one common form of it involves a real respect for natural processes and allowing them to occur, and a recognition that humans are just one small part of the overlying natural world, of the overarching natural world. And so if you have that perspective, you're going to respect the value of nature in itself, and you're not going to want humans to destroy it because artificiality is bad. And then the versions, again, of Buddhism that become dominant in China, one of the things they add as Buddhism comes in from India is it gets combined with this Taoist respect for the natural world. And so a lot of Chinese Buddhists have this immense admiration for the natural world. So you're absolutely right. There are these indigenous traditions of environmental respect that people are influenced by and can self-consciously draw on. By the way, I meant to say in response to, the gentleman got up, but I meant to mention in response to his question too, related to this, since Confucius, I have met a number of people in China who are more interested in Taoist ideas because they read Taoist thinkers, either the Tao Te Ching attributed to Lao Tzu or the Zhuangzi as advocating either pluralism or a kind of laissez-faire. And again, laissez-faire is often associated with the right in the West, but China's at a different point in its historical development, and kind of telling the government to just lay hands off of people's personal lives and their, as well as their economic lives, that can be a very emancipatory notion in the Chinese context. And so I know some Chinese thinkers were inspired by the notion of wu-wei, non-action, just like Francois Quesnay was in developing the notion of laissez-faire in the West. And other ones who, there are passages in the Taoist classic, the Zhuangzi, that suggest different creatures have different natures. And the implication seems to be that different humans might also have different natures. And so we shouldn't expect humans to all live the same way. There's this great metaphor in the Zhuangzi where there's this creature called chaos, primal chaos. And his friends who visit him say, "Oh, it's so sad because he doesn't have any eyes or ears or nose or mouth." And so they say, so they drilled, holes into him for his mouth and his nostrils and his ears, and then he died. And the implication is, you're trying to force someone else to live according to your nature, when instead you should just let them live according to your own nature. I honestly don't think Zhuangzi intended that as a political metaphor, although maybe I'm being unimaginative. But for sure, people have said, I know people who say, we're not interested in Confucianism, we're not interested in these stories about supposedly heroic Confucians fighting the government on behalf of the common people. What we like are these Taoist ideas about non-interference on the part of government and respecting the plurality of natures that individuals have.
We have 20 more minutes, so please, no one's going to die of exhaustion before that, yes.
There's been several mention of the strong relation between Buddhisms, in particular, between Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism. As I'm unfamiliar with these movements in Chinese thought, what particular Buddhist traditions were most influential in India?
Right, so you do get, all the major Buddhist movements, you get versions of them in China. So you get a version of Yogacara in the consciousness-only school. You get a version of Madhyamaka. But what becomes distinctive is you go from an emphasis on no self in the Indian tradition to the Chinese version of it in distinctively Chinese schools like Huayan, Flower Garland Buddhism, which doesn't have an exact analog in the Indian tradition, and Chan, better known in the West as Zen Buddhism, which is very influenced by Huayan. And they're both influenced by Madhyamaka Buddhism of Nagarjuna, but whereas Nagarjuna wants to tell us, look, everything's empty in the sense of lacking an independent self, because everything dependently originates. Everything originates dependent on something else. The direction Chinese Huayan Buddhism takes that is, yeah, everything is dependent on something else. So what really exists is the entire web of interconnections. And that is real. That is a self. But it's a transpersonal self. And so it's not a move I think Nagarjuna is going to make, but that's the move they make in the Chinese tradition. And so there's not an individual self, so there's no grounds for selfishness, but there is a transpersonal self. So, and we sometimes see metaphors like in Shantideva, who's influenced by Nagarjuna. In the Indian tradition, he says, well, look, you know, your hand will work to take a thorn out of your foot, even though they're not the same because they're connected. And so, you know, that's a metaphor of a whole. You could think of that as a metaphor of a whole, you know, being interconnected. But that becomes the central metaphor in Chinese Buddhism, where they talk about there being one substance or one self that we all share. And they say, you know, you should care for another person the same way you should care, your left hand should care for your right hand, because you're parts of one whole. So that's the form in which it takes. It's a weird kind of spin. You can see where they got to it, but again, as you know, it's not a move Nagarjuna or Shantideva is going to make. So it's kind of surprising, in part because the Buddhists in India are reacting against things like Advaita Vedanta, which is a kind of monism, so they're not going to go that way. Whereas in China, they're not reacting against Advaita Vedanta, and so they're not allergic to monism. So they have to endorse a version of it. And so, but then what this ends up giving you is a picture in which the attachment to my parents as parents is a mistake, because to see them as separate, independent individuals is an illusion, which helps explain why Buddhist monks and nuns in China are celibate, and they leave their families behind, and they dress in a way that makes them look like other Buddhist monks and nuns, because you want to eliminate these indications of individuality and just become part of the whole. And so the Confucians, again, after centuries of dominance of Buddhist ideas, because after the fall of the Han Dynasty, in the 6 dynasties period up through the Tang, Buddhism is really dominant. Confucianism is not dominant. So everybody's versed in these ideas, and so when Confucianism starts to react against Buddhism, the ethical idea is you Buddhists are bad because you're selfishly trying to escape suffering by turning your back on your ethical obligations to your family and to the state. So that's the ethical challenge. But then they have to justify this in terms of a metaphysics. So the Neo-Confucian metaphysics says, yes, there is a transpersonal nature which we all share, but that transpersonal nature is individuated by allotments of qi, that's QI in pinyin or CH apostrophe I in the older way Giles romanization that people like me originally grew up on, this underlying stuff. And so the idea is this table, the underlying nature of this table is the same as the underlying nature of my French bulldog. It's the same as the nature of the universe. But the table and my bulldog and I are individuated by the qi that makes up the table and the bulldog and me. And so the qi is what makes there be individuals, which justifies things like filial piety. But the underlying commonality of our nature is what justifies the compassion that you should have for everybody. And again, even though Confucians think that you have these special obligations to family members, they're very clear that doesn't mean you get to ignore everybody else. You have an obligation to work for the well-being of the common people and to help others. It's just you have special obligations to family members, friends, teachers, things like that. So the Neo-Confucians try to have it both ways. They want to have the universal compassion that you get from a version of monism, but they want to have the particular attachments you get through a kind of individuality, which is in that monism as well. Their slogan is Li Yi Feng Shu, which is the pattern is one, but its manifestations are diverse. Now, whether they can pull this off metaphysically, I'm not sure. I always worry that the Neo-Confucians really can't have their cake and eat it too, because they want to have the best of both worlds. And I'm not sure they can pull it off, but that's how it's supposed to work metaphysically. It's a really neat metaphysical picture. It's just a question that they can work it out. And I say that's what the new Confucians are not Neo-Confucians, but they've absorbed so much of the Neo-Confucian way of thinking. And they just adopt all these ideas about, like I say, this is just straight out of, they say in the Manifesto that distinctive of Chinese thought is that the pattern of nature is the same as the pattern of heaven, and your individual original mind is the same with the mind of the universe. That comes straight out of Neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Xi, writing in the 12th century, who says there's only one overarching pattern within heaven and earth. Human nature is just the pattern. Our nature is the pattern of heaven. Sorry, was your hand up?
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. Thanks again, Prime Minister. It was a really interesting talk. I'm kind of selfish, really. And I look at where I am right now in this South African context in 2019, where we have student protests, kind of evolution from feasible to fall, but I was watching YouTube videos just the other day, even at WITS. I walked through WITS today and I saw these pillars and I thought, I recognise this, I've never been to WITS campus before, but yeah, they were throwing tear gas bombs here, I guess so. And we're going through this lovely history and I'm thinking, oh dear, I recognise this. We are just before Chairman Mao, right? This is where we're sat. So what I'm wondering is, how, following these sort of various different forms of Chinese culture, really, did Maoism, Chairman Mao suddenly appear, and that train of millions of people died under Mao, right? How did that train not get stopped? I mean, I sit here worrying that the Malema train's going to come through and Malema's the next Mao.
Yeah. I think that. I can't. I don't know enough to have an informed opinion about the details of the South African situation.
Neither do I.
Yeah. but the crucial thing about Mao is there's a new book out about this. I should have picked it up. I just saw it in a bookstore. But it's about Mao's rise to power. And again, what happens is the early Communist Party. Can see what motivated them and why you might have seen that as a legitimate position to have at that point. And the advice that the early Chinese Communist Party was getting from the Soviet Union was actually bad tactical advice, and Mao was a good strategist. And so when it turned out that Mao's military strategy was the right one, that gave him a lot of cachet. Then he was also a really ruthless but very effective politician. He just systematically undermined his opposition until by the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is to say World War II, he was the paramount, undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, again, it took a while, even given the grotesque failures of the Great Leap Forward, it took a while for anybody to even limit his authority at all and to stop the wheels on the Great Leap Forward, despite all the deaths and the horrible things that were occurring. But he still had a lot of charisma, and people were very impressed with him. And so when he called on students to drop out of universities and to go and get rid of the last vestiges of feudalism and capitalism in society, nobody really had the power to stop him. He had the charisma, and he had the social cachet, and there's a long tradition in China, which actually ties back into Confucianism, of students being politically active. So it always strikes me one of the intellectual differences between China and the US is generally, there are exceptions, but my experience of interacting with people in China is people generally like students. They kind of think students are, out to help society and are going to be good people. I can't speak for other countries, but in the U.S., a lot of people are just like, oh, college students, they're so spoiled, and they think they know it all. And I never hear that in China. It's just like, oh, they're working so hard. Yeah, they're working for the future of China. That's great. So this idealism of the students, and they're the ones who led the May 4th movement. So calling on them to drop out and to get rid of these negative elements in society was hard for anybody to say no to that. And then with the power of that, with these students running around who are loyal only to Mao, he can get rid of anybody he wants, and that's what he did. And so as the Cultural Revolution started to get out of hand, people like Liu Shaoqi and like Deng Xiaoping tried to bring it under control, but they just couldn't. They couldn't get the genie out of the bottle. It was this crazy. It was just adoring children, through university students running around believing nothing but Chairman Mao, it got so crazy that Red Guard units were actually fighting each other because they were like engaging in military conflicts because they were fighting over who was more radical, you know. A little aside, the Umberto Eco has this story about being in a cafe, that the Italian author and semiotician has a story about being in an Italian cafe, and somebody comes and asks him to sign this petition in favor of this left-wing group he's never heard of. And he just kind of looks at it, and he looks at the woman with the petition and says, "They're fascists." And and she calls him an obscene term and runs away. But he doesn't have any idea who this is. He just knows it'll make her go away, you know. And that's a thing people do. You just, no matter how radical the people are that come up, you just say, "Oh, Mao, fascist," you know. But that's the one person you couldn't call a fascist. But everybody else, they just, you know, they weren't left-wing enough. And so that was essential. Nothing else could have made this happen except the exact kind of position and revolutionary cachet that Mao had. So unless there's, the student revolt is something that happens all over the world, and you know, I often say I'm one of those weird people. In some alternative universe, I'm a really right-wing educational fundamentalist, because I generally think that professors know better than students. And when students bring me things, a lot of times I'm like, oh God, you guys don't understand this at all. You know, they can be so self-righteous and so uninformed. It just drives me nuts. But on the other hand, a lot of times the reason change occurs is the students militate for it. So I think students can be a really valuable source of change, and their idealism and their openness to new ideas can be important, even though I'm the first to acknowledge sometimes their lack of experience and their over-enthusiasm for being as radical as possible can sometimes lead them to be very naive about things that those of us who thought about it more and understand it better, realize is misguided. So I don't know enough about the situation here in South Africa, but I wouldn't worry about Maoism per se, because that occurred because of a very particular context that would be very hard to reproduce.
Yeah, and if it's any consolation, then history doesn't repeat itself, only historians.
Yeah, well, maybe you worry more about Stalinism than that specific movement in Southern Vietnam. So I'm interested in the philosophy of law and specifically aesthetics of law, which sounds like a pretty strange field. I don't know anything about Chinese law, and it's really difficult to get comparative literature on Western and Chinese law. So the aesthetics of law basically looks at how the materialist field, how the environment shapes how normative orders and symbolic orders change. So in comparing those broadly three streams, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism and communism,
Oh yeah.
How does the law change in your experience? How do normative orders change as those things?
Yeah, the Confucians are the ones who are most interested in issues of government and law. So you do get political figures historically who are Taoists. And you get periods in Chinese history where Taoists gain the ear of the emperor and they get a lot of influence at court. Same thing with Buddhists. Sometimes Buddhists will just get influence at court and they end up being politically very influential. But at their core, Taoism and Buddhism are kind of anti-governmental philosophies. At their core, that's not what they're about. And so, but in a way, that gives them survivability. There's actually been a rebirth of Buddhism as well, and even Tibetan Buddhism in China, because insofar as it's a self-cultivation ethic, Buddhism can stay neutral on government issues. And the same thing about Taoism. It doesn't have to take a stand on government issues. There have been exceptions, but generally they can do that. So the Confucians are the ones who are interested in actually governing and developing government. Confucians in general there's something to this point. It's not a completely crazy point that the new Confucian Manifesto makes, that we tend to see in China a more rounded and spiritual wisdom as opposed to the square wisdom of the West, because Confucians are very much about flexible wisdom and responding differently in different contexts depending on the needs of the context. Right? So one of my favorite passages in the Analects is disciple comes to Confucius, asks him a question. Confucius says, no, you absolutely should not do that. A little later, a second disciple comes in, asks exactly the same question in exactly the same words. Confucius says, yes, you absolutely should do that. A third disciple asks the question, exactly the same question. And Confucius says, well, the first guy's overly headstrong, so I wanted to rein him in. The second guy's, always making excuses for not acting, so I wanted to push him forward. And this little passage becomes the basis of an entire hermeneutic and educational strategy, and indeed ethical strategy for the rest of Confucianism, which is flexible responsiveness to situations. There's more of a fetishism, I would say, of strict obedience to the law in the Anglo-European tradition, although we also know they're going to flexibly apply the law as well. But generally in the Chinese tradition, the law is more advisory. And so there is a rich legal tradition, and I'd have to look it up, but a long time ago I took a course on Chinese law, and I'm sure my sources are out of date, but I read a book on the Qing Dynasty legal code. And one of the points it made was it said, it actually functions a lot like Western legal codes. And so it's got the same kinds of, it's got exceptions built in, it's got the same procedures it's got procedures for appeal, it's got procedures for amendation, and so formally there are structural similarities to European law in a lot of ways. But in general, Confucians emphasize flexibility in the fact you can't always follow the law. Again, I'm worried because the Manifesto wants to make this into an absolute distinction, but I've read Plato and Aristotle, and Plato and Aristotle says, when it comes to ethics, you have to follow the lesbian ruler. And what that means, the commentators tell us, is on the island of Lesbos, they developed a lead ruler that you could wrap around unevenly shaped objects to measure them. And so Aristotle says when it comes to ethics, it's not like math. He says this explicitly. He says, ethics is not math. You've got to be flexible. That's what wisdom is. And Plato actually says similar kinds of things. So I actually think there are examples of rounded spiritual wisdom in the Western tradition, but in fairness, law is more often taken to be advisory in the Chinese tradition, whereas and again, this is an amateur's view of the Anglo-European legal tradition, which you're probably wincing at internally, but more often a kind of a strictness about the law. I think about A Man for All Seasons, this classic play about Sir Thomas More. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a great scene where they're talking about how he should arrest somebody. And Sir Thomas More says, well, what laws has he broken? And he says, God's laws. And Sir Thomas More says, well, God can arrest him then. And he says, no, you've got to stop this guy because, he's going to do bad things. And he says, so you tear down all the laws to get this guy. And the guy who's talking to him says, yes, I would. And he says, and then when you've torn down all the laws and the devil comes raging for you, where will you find protection now that you've torn down all the trees in the forest that you might hide behind? He says, the laws sometimes protect the guilty, but they also protect the innocent. I can't imagine a Confucian thinker thinking that. But that's a very classic Western thing. And I get goosebumps just remembering that scene. I watched it like 800 times. It's the best scene in the world. So I can really get into that. But again, Confucian is going to be like, are you so obsessed about law? Is the guy bad? Well, freaking arrest him. Is there a law for it? Maybe not. We'll write one later. The guy, he's going to do something bad. Use your wisdom. That's why you cultivate wisdom, so you can use it. So and we see that in China now too, where, again, the people who want a more Western-style system are like, we need Western-style laws where you can't just violate them, where the judge doesn't have as much discretion, and you actually have to follow the laws because that will protect our rights. Whereas in a way, the communist government is in a way more in line with the Confucian ideal of flexibility on the part of rulers and officials who are supposed to use their wisdom to make the right choice. But that can be very dangerous.
Thanks. One last question, and then we'll wind up for the day.
Thank you again. I wanted to draw, I don't know to what extent it will fit into the talk, but I saw that you were drawing on Liu Xun as well.
Yeah.
I read a couple of books by Sino-Japanese or Pierre Reitmans.
Oh, yeah.
One of them particularly Chinese Shadows, but also the Chairman's New Clothes, and where he also states that the cyclical nature of authoritarianism, especially in light of during just after the Cultural Revolution, where all this bunch of crazy admiring Maoists who were just admiring and not seeing all the kind of flaws of the kind of regime, and where he was going into this kind of, he said, well, even after the Cultural Revolution, even though it's become more accessible for foreigners now to explore and do things, and more temples are being opened, and he also draws on some of the ancient philosophy, if I recall correctly. But he always said that no matter how much you open, there's always the cyclical nature of the authoritarianism. And how do you read that against this kind of various forms of philosophy nowadays? I don't know if it's a real question, it's more like thinking about.
I mean, everybody, how do I want to phrase this? People were horrified that Xi Jinping went back on the precedent that had been set by Deng Xiaoping of term limits for leaders in China. And everybody I know who's not a complete zealot for the government is just really horrified about what this suggests for the future of China. But, and again, it depends on who you talk to. I talk to some people, and this is what I tend to think, that sooner or later, Xi Jinping has to die. And when he dies, part of what happened with Xi Jinping was he was, a very particular individual who had gotten himself into a very particular position of power so that he could take advantage of the system and make himself essentially president for life.
That would then be one cycle.
Then, so yeah, I think it's only going to be one cycle. I think when he dies, there's going to be a power struggle, but whoever wins is not going to have the kind of power he did. Because how would they? Because to have that kind of power, Xi Jinping wouldn't allow anybody to have that kind of power under him. So in a way, he's going to set things up so that it has to occur, that there's going to be a power struggle, and then whoever gains power will need to have a coalition. And again, in the long run, what we saw happen in South Korea, we saw happen in Taiwan, was, although it was a bloody process, we have a process which led to genuine democracy. And there were massacres in both Taiwan and South Korea in the process of getting toward genuine democracy, but eventually these cultures got there. And so I think in the long run, China will get to some form of democracy. It doesn't have to be exactly a Western form. I think most, even intellectuals in China don't. They look at the United States, for example, and they're like, they don't want that. On the other hand, I have some Chinese friends who are very pessimistic. And they just say, yeah, Xi Jinping will die eventually, but the government will always be authoritarian. The Chinese Communist Party will always control China.
So just to add on that, so yes, you have more parties than the Communist Party, but they're completely insignificant.
Right.
So it's basically a question of the Communist Party where you have over 100 million members.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask is that within this analysis of Sino-Japanese in the 70s, that yes, you might have Xi Jinping dying, so that's one cycle, but then afterwards, basically the power structure and the authority gets discussed again within the Communist Party, so it's kind of like a cycle of new things coming up. I mean, even after Hu Jintao, people would have thought, well, we're going towards more opening up.
And you're right, and again, this is what many of my Chinese friends point out. They say it's hard from the outside, we haven't been in China, to realize just how integrated the Communist Party is into everything. And so to get rid of it, you're going to really have to change all kinds of power structures. On the other hand, we do have a weird situation where nobody that takes communism or Marxism seriously. So it's hard to take the Communist Party seriously except as a raw exercise of power. And generation after generation, you get these young people in China who don't remember the the few good things the party has done. They're not optimistic about the past or nostalgic about the past, and they want to have a greater say in things. But as I say, I think maybe I'm a little. I've got that kind of attitude of the old saying that Martin Luther King Jr. liked to cite, that the arc of history bends gradually towards justice. And maybe that's overly optimistic, but it helps me sleep at night if I believe it. So that's what I tend to think. But I have very well-informed Chinese friends who are just like, China will never be free. That's their view.
I think there's something that connects both Ben's question and Roman's question. And this is a wonderful book that was written by Anatoly Yuchak after the Soviet Union ended. And the title of the book is Everything Was Forever and Then It Was No More. And I think that's when one thinks about historical processes, I think we need to think like you do. I mean, think really like a historian with context, conjuncture, circumstance, and less about the inevitability of things. So in the future, who knows? But thank you so much.
Thank you
for being with us, for the generosity with which you've given your time and your books. I've never seen anyone give away books like that, and it's a model lesson for me. And I think over these 2 lectures, you've given us a span of understanding not only a country, but its way of thinking. And thank you so much for being with us, and we hope you come more often to Wix, and I'll make sure that you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.